um, all the participants to mute their microphones, and the event will be also broadcast live on Facebook. So if you don't want your face to be shown on Facebook, then you can switch off the camera as well. So let me warmly welcome everybody, all of you in the Facebook Live broadcast, and also let me welcome the panelists and all the participants. My name is Esther Nagy. I'm an economist and former diplomat. I am the Secretary General of the Hungarian group of the Union of European Federalists. Let me also introduce Balázs Brandt, who is the head of the Hungarian group of JEF, the Young European Federalists. He's going to be a co-moderator and help us, asking the questions and so on. Democracy is Europe. This is a project by the Union of European Federalists, and the purpose of this project is to promote a better understanding of the European Union for European citizens and connecting the processes of that took place 30 years ago with the ideals of Europeanism. We would like to promote the common thinking process about European core values and the future of Europe. Today's discussion is the second of a series of two virtual events that we organized in Budapest, in quotes. And our topic today is the situation of democracy and the current challenges in European Union and Hungary, also the social perception of democracy in both the Union and Hungary, and how to efficiently promote European values. I will introduce our three panelists, and then they will each give a short speech, 5 minute speech at the beginning, and then we will ask them questions. And finally, the uh, the viewers can ask questions through the chat box, and also during the discussions you can pose your questions through the chat box. First of all, let me introduce Zoltan Flack. He is a lawyer and sociologist and an associate professor at the ELTE University and head of the Center for Theory of Law and Society. He's a founding editor of Control Legal Sociology journal, professional journal, and he's a member of the editorial board of Equality periodical. And he has won the Freedom of the Press Award in 2009. He's going to provide an insightful contribution to our discussions on the rule of law. Next panelist is Esther Kiersch, who is a legal associate, has been working as a legal associate for the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, and contributed to the visits to detention facilities, and she has been actively involved in monitoring international and Hungarian representation of interest. She was involved in transnational projects targeted at the efficient control of hate crime and human rights issues, as well as the operation of the national human rights institutions. The third panelist is the managing director of Public Earth Research Institute. His name is Andras Pulai. He's a strategic director of his institute as well. He has conducted European studies and international studies in Hungary, Austria, and London. His key purpose, his key goal in his research is to apply the complex approaches and methods and actual trends that he has seen in abroad to apply them in Hungary with the help of his excellent associates. So, first of all, let me ask our panelists to give us a 5 to 7 minutes introductory speech on the key challenges for democracy in Hungary and the European Union. Of course, this topic is huge, so it's very difficult to talk about it briefly, but maybe our panelists will be able to give us an insight from the point of view of their own special areas. First of all, let me ask Zoltan Flack, as a lawyer and a sociologist, how would you briefly summarize the current challenges for democracy in Hungary and the European Union. What are the key problems? Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy that I can talk about this topic and rule of law and democracy problems in Hungary in a European context. I'm very happy that the organization gave your organization gave a chance to talk about this in this particular context. Of course, it's a huge topic, and we could discuss it in a half a year seminar actually. So it's a huge challenge for us to talk about it. But it's even for a bigger challenge for the general situation of democracy. I think we can discuss this issue at several levels. And just as you mentioned in your introductory speech, we can talk about it in the Hungarian level and the European level as well. As far as the Hungarian voters, Hungarian citizens, Hungarian people with democratic affiliations may feel that this situation is a very turbulent, and the world is very difficult to understand, and they may feel that this is just part of the part of the problem, and sometimes we are victims of optical illusions, and we tend to think that the biggest problems are always in our subjective little worlds, and for the particular individual it is indeed the most important problem, but we might also look at what we call, liberal democracies, parliamentary democracy, and the institutions that we use in that context. Well, it has faced such significant challenges over the past few years, which are very difficult to answer, and not they cannot be answered in a few years. It requires maybe the work of generations to address all these problems, and it may be related to economic and other uh, other crises which we would need to handle or manage, and that's not my intention to widen the topic of today's discussion, because it's already big enough, but I would like to reflect on the core statement that we, or the bottom line that we identified at first, is that, is it true that the a party-based representation, parliamentarian representation, can truly best represent the interests of a society? How can we stimulate political activity among citizens? How can we improve the public discourse with real civil political work, and revitalize our political institutions, and whether we can actually address and answer the global challenges? And I could go on and on with these questions. So maybe what I'm trying to say is that maybe our smallest problem, which is the problem of the rule of law in Hungary, and the um, and the opportunities for the European Union to address them, maybe these two things cannot really be separated from the global issues that are faced by democracy all over the world. Just if you think about the inauguration of Joe Biden as US president and the events that surrounded the change of administration in the United States. So that's my introductory speech. And thank you very much for Zoltan, Flack, for widening the topic. And of course, we might not be able to address all of these issues, but I'm very happy that you pointed out the importance of NGOs and civil organizations. And that was one of the key motivation why we wanted to invite somebody from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, Esther Kiersch, namely, because she can offer a point of view of NGOs and civil organizations, civil societies, So how would you react, Esther,
Igen,
to
köszönöm szépen, és
Zoltan
köszönöm
Flack's
a
introductory
meghívást,
comments?
hogy
Thank you
itt
very much,
lehetek,
and thank you very much for the
becsatlakozhatok ebbe a
invitation.
beszélgetésbe. Nagyon nagy
Uh, I,
szabadságot kaptunk a
we have
tekintetben, hogy miről
been given a
beszéljünk.
lot of freedom
Úgyhogy
as
én
to
most
what we
egész
can
egyszerűen csak
talk about today. So
rácsatlakozom
I will
a
just
Zoli
simply connect
bevezetőjére,
to what Zoltan
és
already
mondjuk
mentioned
két ponton
and
fűzöm
join
hozzá a
in
gondolataimat.
to his
Az
speech
egyik,
and
hát a civil
add my
társadalom,
own
nyilván a
thoughts.
civil
First of
társadalom,
all,
most itt
the civil
Eszter
societies or
említett a Magyar
NGOs,
Helsinki Bizottságot, nyilván civil
and
társadalom
Esther
alatt egy
mentioned
sokkal
the
szélesebb
Hungarian
kört értünk,
Helsinki
és nem csak a
Committee,
civil
but there's
szervezeteket, mint a
many
Magyar
more
Helsinki
civil
Bizottság, az én
organizations
szervezetem.
and
De
NGOs
az
in
tény,
Hungary, not just this one,
hogy
but
számos
it's a fact that
támadás, kormányzati támadás
the government
szemtanúi
has
és tapasztalói
attacked
lehetünk az
many of
elmúlt években,
our civil
ami a civil
organizations over
társadalom
the past
különböző
few years,
szegmenseit
and
érte.
these attacks were aimed at
Ebből a
various
szempontból
segments of the civil
egyébként
society.
részben, csak hogy
And in
tényleg
that
valamennyire
regard,
észszerűen
just to give you
körvonalazzam a
a
mondandómat ebben az
rational
5
overview
percben,
of what I'm going to talk
hogy
about
mondjuk
in this next
aktuális
five
fejleményre
minutes,
utaljak,
let me
ami
mention
viszont
a
kifejezetten a civil
specific
szervezeteket
and
érinti, és
latest
ami mondjuk
development
pozitív
which affects the
fejleményként
civil societies and
értelmezhető,
civil
és az
associations,
Európai
and it
Unióhoz is
could be
kapcsolódik,
interpreted as a positive
akkor mondjuk a
sign
nyári
related to the
luxemburgi
European Union
bírósági
as well.
ítélet jut
And
eszembe, ami
specifically
hát az
the
Európai
verdict
Uniós
of the
jog
European Union
szempontjából
Court, which
elfogadhatatlannak
is
minősítette és
which
jogellenesnek minősítette azokat a
deemed
jogszabályokat, amelyeket az elmúlt években hozott a
the
magyar
deemed as
törvényalkotó, amelyek a civil
illegal
szervezeteket
or
támadták.
unlawful
Gondolok itt
any
a
of the
stopsoros csomagra, amelyek ugye
Hungarian
büntetőjogi,
government's
adójogi
many of the Hungarian
vonatkozásokat is
government's
tartalmaztak, mindkét
anti-NGO
szempontból
measures that were
próbálják
taken, for
célba
example,
venni
the
a
Stop
civil szervezeteket,
Soros
másrészt pedig ugye itt
um,
magára
legal
a
package that was adopted by
külföldről
the government,
támogatott
and also
szervezet
the other
kategóriájának megalkotása, és az
thing was
a
when the Hungarian
normatív
government
környezet
created a
létrehozása,
category of NGOs supported
hogyha
from
itt éves
abroad,
szinten
and how
7
they need to define
több
and
mint 7
report
millió forint
their contributions. Like, for
támogatás
example,
érkezik egy
if they
szervezethez, ami
receive
éves
over
szinten azért nem
7
olyan nagy
million
összeg
forints
külföldről,
per
akkor ugye
year
itt
from abroad,
bejegyzés,
then they will have to
regisztráció
register as
kötelesség,
an
illetve a
NGO supported
támogatók
from abroad,
adatainak
and they have to
megadásra az állami
supply
hatóságoknak,
the
hogy a különböző publikációkon
specific data of
feltüntetni,
their
hogy mi
patrons,
külföldről
and
támogatott
indicate
szervezet vagyunk. Ugye
in
ez a
their various
megbélyegzés
publications
célozza alapvetően, és az Európai Unió Bírósága kimondta ezt nyáron,
that
hogy
we
ez
are an organization
tehát
supported from
ellentétben
abroad.
áll,
But this,
összeegyeztetetlen az
according to
uniós
the
joggal,
verdict of the Court of the
és
European
ideértve a
Union, this is
donorok alapvető
incompatible
jogait
with the
is.
EU law,
Na most ez egy
and
dolog,
this is a good
ez
news
jutott
for
ugye a
us.
civil
This is
társadalom szempontjából
what
eszembe.
I
Mi lett
could
a
reflect on
következménye
from the
ennek a
point of view of
bírósági
the
ítéletnek? Egyelőre
NGOs, and
nem
what could
látjuk a
be the
következményét.
consequences
Tehát
of
egyelőre
this
nem látjuk azt, hogy
EU
az érintett
court decision.
jogszabályokat
We don't
hatályon
know
kívül
yet. We
helyezték
don't
volna,
know, we
ezek
can't see the
továbbra is
Hungarian
érvényben
government
vannak,
following up on
ami
the
végül is
verdict of the
egy
European Court.
unión belül ugye legfelsőbb bírói szinten
And even
hozott
though that
döntés
court
semmi
is a
bevételét
supreme court within the
demonstrálja.
European
Ez az
Union,
egyik,
it
ami
seems that the
eszembe jutott,
Hungarian
de ugye nyilván mi
government is
civilek, civil
ignoring these
szervezetek
verdicts.
elsődlegesen bizonyos
And
társadalmi csoportok
also, if
védelmén
we look
dolgozunk,
at
az
NGOs
emberi jogi
that
szervezetekre
typically
gondolván,
represent the interest of
és
particular
ezzel
social
kapcsolatban
groups
viszont egy
and human
másik
rights
ügy jut
groups,
eszembe, ami
and
ugyancsak
this
aktuális, és
brings me
ugyancsak
to another
megdöbbentő
thought,
itt az
which is
elmúlt
very
évből
recent and maybe
az
astounding
európai
for
közös
many of us,
értékek
is that
szempontjából és a
the
magyar helyzet szempontjából. Ez
European
pedig a
common
gyöngyöspatai
values,
ügy. Ugye a Magyar Helsinki
like
Bizottság is
the
már
Gyöngyöspata
nem fő
affair, the
feladatunk
Hungarian
a
Helsinki
roma
Committee, even
kisebbség
though
jogainak
our
védelme, de
primary goal is
bizony,
not to
hála
represent,
Istennek,
not,
jó pár
it's not our
ponton
primary goal to
csatlakozunk ez a
represent the
témához, és
Roma
próbáljuk
minorities, but we
a saját
joined
eszközeinkkel
in
és
and
stratégiánk
try to
keretében
deploy our own means or
segíteni ezt a
use our
társadalmi
resources to
csoportot,
help
és az
these social
megdöbbentő
groups.
volt, ami
And
az
it was
elmúlt
shocking
évben
for
zajlott
us
az
what
oktatási
happened
szegregáció
in the
ügyében.
educational
Megdöbbentő
segregation,
volt,
in terms
hogy
of educational
kormányzati
segregation of the
képviselők
Roma
a
people.
magyar
We were
bíróságokra, ideértve a
astounded and
kúriát is
shocked
nyomást
how
próbáltak
government
gyakorolni,
officials have been
annak
trying to
érdekében,
exert
hogy azt a
enormous
bizonyos
pressure in order
pénzügyi kártérítést ne
to
ítéljék
withdraw in
kifizethetőnek
order to make
az
the
sok éven
court
keresztül elszenvedett oktatásban
not to
történő
pay,
szegregációt
not to
elszenvedett
allow the
roma
payment of
polgártársainknak.
damages to the Roma people who
Ez és
suffered
különböző kormányzati nyilatkozatok
discrimination in
arról, hogy ez a
educational
pereskedés, ez a
environment.
soros
And
ügynökök műve,
the
és
government has been
egyébként pedig a
communicating
magyar
the
emberek ezt
message
nem
that this is
fogadhatják el, hogy
the
munkanélkül,
deed
és
of
most
the
idézek, tehát ezek nem a saját
Soros
szavaim,
Foundation. And now I'm
munkanélkül
quoting
a
that
roma
we
emberek
cannot
a
allow
személyiségi
Roma
jogaik sérelme és
people
legalapvető jogaik
to
sérelme esetében
get
jogosultak
significant
lehessenek
amounts of money
kártérítésre. És erről beszéltünk, és nem
because
akarok, mert
of
azt hiszem, hogy
what
itt lassan az 5
happened to
percen
them
végén járok,
in
vagy
terms
lehet,
of
hogy már
human rights. And
túlléptem.
I'm now
Tehát nagyon
really
szívesen
getting
bocsátkozom még
to
az
the
ezzel
end to my
kapcsolatos
5 minute section,
részletekben.
and
Ez
if you are
számomra az
interested, I
egyik
would love to give you
legmegdöbbentőbb
more details
eset
about this,
volt az
but this was
elmúlt
the most shocking
évből.
case
Számos egyéb
for
is
me
van,
in the
de most itt az 5 percben próbáltam
in
mondjuk
the past
két fejleményt
year.
gyorsan
So
összefoglalni, ami
of course,
gondolatébresztő
there are many
lehet.
others, but I wanted to
Köszönöm
highlight
szépen!
these two so that they could be a food for thought for all of us. Thank you very much, Esther Kiersch, for your introductory remarks and for mentioning these two specific topics, because that's how we can actually relate to it, if we can actually list very concrete cases. And now let me give the floor to Andras Pulai. You, as opinion polling and research company, you have been monitoring the Hungarian people's attitude towards the European Union. In your judgment, in your view, what is the position of the Hungarian people on the rule of law and the relations with the European Union? Does it appear that the Hungarian people have a demand for the rule of law, and what is the general opinion about it in Hungary? Uh-oh, we can hear him. Ah, now it's okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, first of all, and thank you for inviting me to this excellent discussion. And I think it's very important to discuss these matters regularly and voice our opinions, even though it might not affect some people in Hungary. But before I answer your questions, let me start from a little further. We have been identifying and monitoring global trends which are necessary for us to understand what is going on in the world around us. It seems that the happy times of peace are over, and the ideals of parliamentary democracy, which were so characteristic in the 20th century, it seems that these happy times are over, which is very bad for us. It makes us very unhappy, but we can detect these trends in the other countries, not only in Hungary. There are many democratic institutions or tools that have been in use, but now they don't seem to work. Or if you look at such countries and Russia as China, who or which tend to push these countries towards different directions with their interventionist politics, and these democratic requirements are very important, and somehow such requirements of democratic institutions did not appear to make an effect on Hungary and some other countries as well. And it seems that the democratic institutions have suffered some damages. If you look at the freedom of the press, it's being eroded in many countries. We can see a lot of reports on the European freedom of the press, and each report shows that the freedom of the press, including the United States, actually, is eroding, is deteriorating. And the the role of parliamentary democracy is also eroding, and this is a very worrying trend on the whole, and it's not very it's somewhat disheartening, but we can also see that there are efforts to correct these things, but sometimes Hungarian government or the Hungarian institutions are, avoiding to apply these measures recommended by the democratic opinion shapers. Hungary must, no matter how unhappy we are about this, Hungary may have been the most important uh, stage where the erosion of democracy occurred, and the European Union just stayed and watched it idly by without doing anything. Sometimes they made some Article 7 allusions, Article 7 threats, but as far as a fundamental, real measure is concerned, they did not take any apart from the past half year. And of course, it is quite obvious that if the EU had the opportunity or had the power to make a very strong remarks or voice very strong concerns about the rule of law half a year ago, then they must have had it a year ago or 2 years ago too. But they failed to do anything, and Germany and France was, kind of preferring to do business with the Hungarian government instead of forcing or enforcing any democratic requirements. And there may have been opportunities for economic interventions or any other political interventions, but they didn't do it, even though they must have clearly been seeing how the Hungarian media situation was changing and deteriorating. So I believe that these transnational and international organizations have a lot of responsibility in terms of how Hungary and these other countries uh, got in this very bad situation. And now going back to the Hungarian situation once again, yes, we do a lot of research and polls on the topic that you asked, and we published it in last December. I would love to share the screen with you, but unfortunately, it's not an available option for me in this Zoom meeting. But I will talk about it in words. So we asked we polled people about the how to how they relate to the European Union, and mm, and there's a very big polarization in Hungary as well about this, and this is a very bad perception, and it shows that the political leaders of each political sides and how efficient they are in terms of communicating to their own camps. For example, democracy as such, it has not really been successfully introduced into the Hungarian education system. I mean, the concept has not been promoted uh, well enough in the Hungarian education system over the past 30 years. So there's not a real well-established notion in the Hungarian students or young people about the role of democracy. And now the last point of my introductory speech is that if you look at the democratic institutions and how they function in Hungary, and we polled people, we posed some statements to them. For example, how true do you think the following statements are? And then the courts and the constitutional court are free of any political influence, and 66% of the people think that it's not true. And the second question is the prosecutor general's office or the prosecution service, how independent is it from political influence? And that was also over 60% who disagrees with it. I mean, disagrees that it's independent, meaning that people, the majority of the people, believe that the supposedly independent institutions are not truly independent from political influence. And there are many other questions that we surveyed, but I can't really tell you in short um, time, but it seems that the majority of the people are convinced that the democratic institutions have been damaged significantly over the past 10 years. Thank you very much. Well, this is not quite an optimistic overview, but that's the reason why we are having this discussion. And thank you very much for specifically mentioning the discussions or negotiations about the recovery plan and the post-COVID recovery plan and the relaunch uh, efforts, because there was an agreement on the veto, and it seems that the European Union, the decision makers in the European Union are convinced that the EU should promote the democratic values even more than before. And now it's a question for Zoltan Flack as to how he thinks these measures could be applied in Hungary and also in other EU member states. How do you view the rule of law criterion, and what kind of expectations do you have in terms of its application? And how effective do you think the EU could be in taking measures for the promotion of the or strengthening the rule of law in the in individual member states? So the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I will start with a shocking thing, meaning that I would like to transfer the institutional things to Esther, because she's an international lawyer and more knowledgeable about these matters. And then I would like to connect to Andras, what Andras said. And it seems the most important thing for us is whether the political will in the EU to tie these uh, 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 so to tie the rule of law criterion to um, to um, funding. And I believe that monitoring of the member state activities, it could be an important tool. And if it's taken seriously in the EU, then I believe that this process could be useful. Of course, uh, it could be a very um, sad for many of our Hungarian citizens that the results of such a process are so long term, and the first results will appear so much later. And I'm not surprised on what Publicus polls show. At least Hungarian people don't have a positive opinion about the damage suffered by the rule of law and the democratic institution in Hungary. Uh, but I'm not sure that this political action and political perception are really in synchronicity. Sometimes it happens that people have a very bad opinion about something, but still do nothing about it. It often happens that people just make do with the conditions that they have to live in, even though they have a very negative opinion about it. And in that regard, I think the message of the European Union is very important, or could be very important, but I have a fear that and might call it a warning, like this monitoring process that we mentioned. The efficiency of this monitoring process depends on how they can find partners for this process, like Hungarian NGOs, Hungarian experts, politicians even, and citizens in general, how they get involved, how the Hungarian society could be involved in this discussion, because that's what will determine the potential effects or the final effects. And to make it more clear, you can judge the deterioration, and you can condemn the deterioration of the Hungarian democratic institutions, but without sanctions, without effective sanctions, which would entail some financial consequences, for example, or even the suspension of certain membership rights, but without real consequences, these consequences also must be legitimate, and they must prevent the Hungarian government from turning the consequences against the general population and transferring or forwarding the effects of these sanctions to the Hungarian general population, and reverse the communication to blame the European Union. So these are very sensitive issues, and these issues must be communicated to the general public all the time. Andras mentioned the responsibility of our education system, and we've been saying for at least 30 years, repeating the same message, that we have to learn from how much energy stable democracies have already put into creating the best rules, regulations for democratic societies, and teaching them to the young people as well. And democratic institutions are always a part of a particular system, a particular country, and they cannot function much better than the particular country does. And also Andras mentioned that we are in the periphery of European Union, and maybe quite a few decision makers in the European Union are interested in keeping us on the periphery. So we might not call it a two-speed Europe or two-class Europe, but we have to prevent this from happening. And yes, monitoring is also important. And the results of the monitoring show that Hungarian democracy is underperforming, and it's very difficult to change. But the conclusion must be that we have to do everything in our power to change that. But some other conclusions may say that, oh, okay, let's just leave things as they are, because these countries were in the periphery 200 years ago, and they are in the periphery now, and there are things that you can just change. Thank you very much for that. This is a kind of federal Europe, and sovereignty is always are in contrast, and people tend to say that our national governments always say that we should keep our sovereignty. And now let me give the floor to Esther Kiersch about what she thinks this rule of law criterion could mean for Hungary, and also NGOs, whether could profit from it, or what impact it could have on the leverage of
óhatatlanul természetszerűleg fűződtek a gondolataim, miközben hallgattam Andrást és Zolit, szóval így organikusan reagálok és kapcsolódok az előttem szólókhoz. Egyrészt egy aprós, hát nem apróság, kijavítom magam. Az András valóban nagyon szkeptikus és pesszimista, és ez nagy részben tudom is osztani ezt a véleményt, de ezzel egy kicsit szembehelyezkednék már, mint azzal az állásfoglalással, hogy az Európai Unió szintjén születő döntések, ideértve ugye a bíróságot is, ezek nem sok hatást tudnak kiváltani konkrétan Magyarországon, és ezért én visszautalnék az elmúlt évvel kapcsolatban konkrétan arra nem csekély fejleményre, hogy itt a májusi luxemburgi bírósági ítélet eredményeképpen felszámolták a tranzitzónákat. Azt gondolom, hogy itt konkrétan a jogellenes fogvatartás egy alapjogi szempontból egészen felháborító formáját, ugye menekülő, menedékkérő, migráns családok, ideértve betegeket, kiskorúakat az ő jogellenes fogvatartásuknak vetett véget az a luxemburgi bírósági ítélet, amelynek eredményeképpen ez a döntés megszületett. De egyébként, és ezt is szóvá tettem, hogy egyébként általában véve osztom azt az álláspontot, hogy az elmúlt 10 éves tapasztalat, az én azt gondolom, hogy mostanra már közhelyé teszi azt a kijelentést, hogy nem lehet kívülről várni a segítséget. Tehát itt lehet jogállamisági újabb kontrollmechanizmust kitalálni az Európai Unióban. Én nem gondolom azt, most már megengedhetjük magunknak azt, hogy arra várunk, hogy az elmúlt elkövetkező években, ideértve a következő országgyűlési választásokat is, majd itt az unió szintjén jön valami nagyon radikális változás, ami megoldja a magyar problémákat. Nem, és itt újra még egy gondolatiszára rácsatlakozom, az állampolgárok bizalomvesztése az intézményrendszerben, ami nem meglepő fordulat, bár osztom Zoli véleményét, hogy ez egy pozitív fejlemény, hogy az állampolgárok így állnak ehhez a kérdéshez, és kritikusan szemlélik egy jelentős arányban. Ezek a mi intézményeink, ezek nem az Európai Unió intézményei, vagy az Európa Tanácsi, az EBSZ, és még sorolhatnám ENSZ, amelynek tagállama Magyarország. Ezek a magyar emberek, a magyar társadalom intézményei, a mi érdekeinket védik, a mi vagyonunkat védik, hogyha korrupciós esetekről van szó, a mi értékeinket kell, hogy képviseljék, és itt azt gondolom, hogy tehát nincs tovább hezitálásra idő, és lehetőség, hogy ne nézzen mindenki egytől egyig szembe azzal a ténnyel, hogy most már nem háríthatja a felelősséget az intézményekre, amit mind tudjuk, ez is most nem akarok elcsépelt kijelentéseket és tényeket ismételni, hogy az ügyészségtől elkezdve a rendőrségen keresztül az adóhatóságig hogyan szövi át a politika ezeket az egyébként független intézményeket, vagy hát ideális esetben abszolút független intézményeket. Ezt a magyar állampolgároknak kell hát eldönteniük egytől egyig, hogy vajon azzal a rendszerrel tud-e értékazonosságot vallani. Akar egy olyan országban élni, ahol azt mondják, hogy mi nem romák, nem fogadjuk el azt, hogy a PTK általános szabályai szerint vagyoni kártérítést kapnak azok a gyerekek, akiket alacsonyabb szintű oktatásban részesítenék, mondok egy példát. Akarjuk-e azt, hogy több mint 1 évig fogva tartsanak kiskorú gyerekes családokat a határon, mi megbecsukjuk a szemünket, mintha mi sem történne, hiszen nem mondjuk Budapesten történik mindez, hanem röszkén a tranzitzónában. Akarjuk-e azt, hogy a mi vagyonunkat használják arra, hogy családi vagyont duzzasszanak, és egyébként a komoly szükségben szenvedő intézményektől pedig mindezt a pénzt elvegyék, idézve a oktatást, vagy éppen az egészségügyet. És itt ezen a ponton én azt hangsúlyoznám, és most itt szándékosan maradok ezen az absztrakciós szinten, mert hogy így indítottam egy ilyen konkrét példákkal, de a beszélgetés dinamikája az inkább egy ilyen absztraktabb szinten zajlik, úgyhogy csatlakozom ehhez. És ebben a természetben még egy nagyon fontos üzenetet hangsúlyoznék, hogy amikor pedig abban a helyzetben van az egyén, hogy milyen lépést tegyen a jelen helyzetben, hallgasson vagy kiálljon, akkor azért azt nagyon fontos tudatosítani, mert hát az intézményi szinten is megjelent már széles körben az öncenzúra. Most aktuálisan nézzük ugye az egyetemek átalakítását, és látjuk azt, hogy bizony nem kollektív a szembehelyezkedés, és az egyetemi autonómia, kutatásszabadság alapján nem zengenek az utcák attól, hogy már pedig a mi egyetemeinket nem veszitek el. Azt kell látni, hogy ebben a hangulatban, ebben még mindig lehet ezzel ellentétes döntést hozni. Senkit nem börtönöznek be azért, hogy kimegy az utcára. Senkit nem. Én tanítok egy egyetemen is, amellett, hogy a Helsinki Bizottságnak dolgozom docensként. Köszönöm szépen, jól vagyok. Nem félek attól, hogy bebörtönöznek, vagy bármilyen más egyéb egzisztenciámat érintő súlyos hátrányért. Tudom, hogy nyilvánvalóan az ember azért, hogyha egy nagyobb intenzitással helyezi magát a nyilvánosság elé, most mondjuk Krekó Péterre gondolok, legutóbbi esetek egyikét, akkor célpontba kerülhet ő személy szerint, és ez sokkal inkább megsínli azt, hogy a véleményét kinyilvánította, de mondjuk én például személy szerint azért, mert mondjuk annak idején a figyelő fekete listájára került a nevem, meg amiatt, mert mit tudom én, Debrecenben a Fidelitás tüntetett többek között velem szemben, mert épp a roma sorozatgyilkosságokról mertem beszélni. Ezek az én életemben nem olyan sérelmek, amitől nem tudnék, köszönöm szépen, nagyon jól funkcionálni. Tehát nem élünk még abban a helyzetben, amikor, most bocsánat, a kifejezést be kellene tojni. Nyugodtan ki lehet állni azokért az értékekért, legyen az demokrácia, emberi jogok, egyenlő emberi méltóság, amit közös európai értékeknek vélünk, és amivel azonosulni tudunk, és belülről megoldani ezt a problémát. Nyilván ez egy sokkal összetettebb kérdés, annál, hogy most itt hip-hop egy 10 perces észrevételben részletesen elemezni bármelyikünk, de minden esetre azt hiszem most itt le is zárom ezt a hozzászólásomat, hogy Andrásnak is legyen még lehetősége hozzászólni.
Definitely. Thank you very much. And Andras, I think the ball is in your court because we talked about how people lose their trust in the system of institutions and how we all play a role in this, so that how it's not something that's completely outside of our influence. So Andras, if you would like to reflect to that or anything that we have heard, I will at least in part reflect to all of this, and I will join the conversation with my meager. So first of all, in reaction to what Esther has said, yes, luckily we are not yet in a situation where a black car comes at night and takes you away. It would be really bad if that came back. And obviously there are boundaries that we think that those that are in power will not cross. And then if you look at education, suddenly things change, and those in power cross the boundary that I don't believe should have crossed in the European Union, and the EU shouldn't have stood by and just looked. And this is not just criticism insofar as the powers are concerned. It's about the police playing a role and arriving with their light flashing, and we already knew that it was just a political intention without any foundation whatsoever. So we are on the boundary, and I'm not at all happy to see that we are on this boundary, because I believe we should put distance between us at this point. And obviously, as somebody playing a public role, I can also say that nobody's limiting me, if you like. I can act as I see fit. Of course, I don't want to speak stupid things, but I don't feel like having to censorship myself. And I do feel, and other people may feel, that they are doing all they can so as to suppress our ideas. And the way the media is uh, looking like is there's a bubble so that we cannot seize control insofar as political community is concerned and to start moving democracy in a direction which is currently possibly undesirable. So I am not satisfied with the situation the way it is. And it's not just Peter Greco who I mean when it comes to that. And what's really good is that the uh, European Court decisions do have some direct impact. For example, on the transit zones or when police are bullying people, and I'm sure that we are saving a lot of people from suffering, and it's important. But we don't really see how these decisions would have an impact on the whole of the system, on the whole of the setup, on the whole of democracy. And as Zoli has already said, there is no intention to have a substantial effect because it's very comfortable for member states of the European Union that Hungary is here on the peripherals, and I really don't see them trying to help in this regard. Of course, I agree that we shouldn't be waiting for external forces. I agree that this is something we have to solve ourselves 100%. But I also think that we have surrendered a part of our sovereignty to them. So we are interconnected and we shouldn't be disadvantaged either. And I think that anybody with a keen eye can see that these processes are not promoting our strive for emancipation because we're talking about democracy, rule of law, freedom of the press. It's just a narrow political community that's fighting for that in Hungary, and it's regretful that 30 years after the democratization, we need to fight for this. Zoli is completely right in that if the so the electors may feel that the EU is forcing certain decisions and certain affairs on us, and I also completely agree that the way these organizations need to act and the way these forces, NGOs need to act is that Hungarian electors don't feel like that, or if they see it as interference, they see it as a positive interference. And I believe this might be the most difficult. And there are some forces I think that who think it would be good to take action. Maybe they are hesitating if because of this, and this is not an easy thing. But we have seen examples of this before. It's in part a matter of trust, and in a part a matter of how these political forces, these organizations, to what extent they can uh, build trust with them and people's trust in that what they are doing is useful for them. And as I have mentioned before, continuing what I've already talked about before, in December, we also asked how much people agree with the EU uh, placing conditions and financial subsidies on the rule of law. And uh, more than 50%, around 60% agreed. And even Fidesz voters, 20% agreed with that. So it's a kind of a recognition on behalf of the Fidesz voters that there may be potentially problems with the way things are in Hungary. And if you look at uncertain voters, close to two-thirds of them believe so as well. So this also goes to show that there is some trust in these organizations. And as others have said before me, this is positive data compared to everything else. And another item of data, I have to say that we also asked voters if this system of criteria is introduced, then your opinion of the EU, will it improve or will it deteriorate? Plainly speaking, if we have some sort of if the EU starts some sort of restrictive process against some member states, such as Hungary, how voters in Hungary will tolerate that? It currently seems that two-thirds of the people think that they would be happy and it would still be a legal institution, the EU. Now, once it happens and once we have consequences which are badly targeted, things might change. But currently, it is clear that trust, or if you like, people have the desire saying that please, dear Europe, please, dear EU, we have put a part, placed a part of our sovereignty in you, then manage that well so that it will be good for us and not that it will be bad for us. Thank you very much for your response. It was a real positive response because we do have a certain degree of trust with the EU. So not all trust has been lost, and we hope it will stay like that. And now that we have outlined the problem and the situation quite well from a lot of points of view, what I would like to ask now is how it we could stop this process of democratic setback, how to turn it around. Obviously, it's $1 million question. It's hard to answer, but I thought if we start thinking together, maybe we can come up with some answers. So, Zoltan, Flack, what do you think from a legal point of view? What would be the first important measures? So how could we return to a democratic rule of law? Well, the basic question is what role does law have in this process? But I don't want to go into that because these are very serious theoretical questions. There's another question which is also not very simple. That is, after 10 years of conscious public law destruction, how can we quickly restore the rule of law and democracy accordingly? And the only thing I can say to that is the fundamental statement is that we have, without changing the basic law, which has been changed several times, we do not have a chance to restore democratic power. And this is a trap. How will new democratic government or parliament majority need to draw up the constitution, especially if they don't have two-thirds? This is a really difficult question, and we have. I believe that constitutional lawyers keep arguing about this all year round. The constitution itself, the basic, as it's a document that expresses fundamental political truths. It plays a very important role in establishing a stable democracy or not. Now, let's not start arguing about what uh, the political elite missed to do after democratization, what kind of mistakes they made by changing the constitution continuously, and by the constitutional court what their mistakes were in not stabilizing certain elements. So how easy it was after 2010 to turn around the democratization process. But I need to say that it will be a huge task for lawyers to restore it because it's in a very sad shape. So we need to start from the basics. And uh, there are no clean slates, so we cannot say that democratization, any revolutionary impetus will start building the legal system from zero. That never happens. So we're gonna have to live together with a lot of these things. But obviously, we cannot live together with this basic law, and it's a very serious thing to say because there are many ideological elements that are important for certain social groups, and their identities depend on it. So I have to say that before we start talking about the role of law, we first need to answer the question how we can establish a social consensus behind a new constitution. This will be a strong question, how we need to write the constitution. And once we have taken care of that, which will be really hard, there will be a lot of pragmatic questions that will be uh, easy to answer once we have a good, stable constitution to take care of it. I don't know if this answers your question. We have a serious dilemma, which on one hand is professional, on another hand is political, and is a serious social question, as Andras has mentioned, that they think that the situation of the rule of law is bad. Can that be transformed into uh, a constitution drafting process? We never had an example of that in Hungary, with the involvement of all social groups arguing about what kind of constitution we need, that this so that the constitution can express the character of a nation and that this can be stabilized. Finally, thank you very much. And this is in complete harmony with what Miklos Haraszti mentioned yesterday, during yesterday's conversation. So the most important thing was the constitution, that we really need a constitution that is based on a consensus and which is not easy to change. And I would like to give the floor to Esther Kiersch. So what kind of ideas do you have? What kind of important steps do you see, also
Most
building
más
on what Zoltan has said?
vonalon indulnék, és
I would
megint itt a
start off by
választópolgár
saying
és
something else
a
once again, talking
választópolgári
about the
tudatosság
voters and the
szempontjából
voter
reagálnék erre a kérdésre.
awareness when taking this
És,
question.
hát a fiatalokba kapaszkodok,
And I'm
nyilvánvalóan,
relying on young people, obviously, because
mert hogy egyrészt mindannyian
on the one
nézzük végig,
hand,
amint a
we are
környezetünkből
all looking at
tehetséges, okos fiatalok hagyják
gifted,
el az
smart
országot, és
young
tényleg
people leaving the
észveszve keresik a
country and
lehetőségeket. Tegnap beszéltem egy
fleeing,
barátnőmmel, és
so
mondja,
to
hogy a
speak. I
fia
talked to a friend
már ott
yesterday
jár, hogy
that
ő
her son
elmegy, nem
is
most épp a
saying
legújabb ötlet, hogy filozófiát tanul Hollandiában, csak el
most
innen,
recent
holott
idea
még
is studying
életében nem
philosophy in
foglalkozott
Holland just to live
filozófiával,
here.
egyébként
He
egy
never
nagyon
got
okos
into
ember,
philosophy before.
de
He's a
egyszerűen a
smart guy, but
lehetőségek csatornáját
basically
vizsgálja, és alapvetően a
looking
fő
at
cél az, hogy
what kind of
elimen.
opportunities
Ez
he
egy
has,
nagyon
and the main
rémisztő
objective
helyzet,
is to leave this
és
country. It's a
ugyanakkor
very
egy nagyon
scary
reménykeltő
situation, and
helyzet is
at the
bizonyos
same time, it's
szempontból,
also a
abból
very
a
hopeful
szempontból,
situation
hogy
from the
a
point of
mai
view
magyar
that
fiatalok egy jelentős része
significant part
európai
of the young
állampolgár, nem csak
people
magyar állampolgár. Én nagyon
Hungary
szeretem a
are acting
hazámat,
as
nagyon
EU
kötődöm a
citizens, not
hazámhoz,
just
nem
as
véletlenül
Hungarian
vagyok
citizens.
itt,
I love
pedig
my
lenne
country.
lehetőségem nem itt
I
lenni.
have strong ties and full
Ennek
confidence
ellenére
that
azt
I'm here,
gondolom, hogy
although I
van
would have
olyan,
other
hogy
opportunities, but
európai
beside it,
közösség,
I think
ami
there is
nem
such a
csak
thing
egy
as a European
szabadon utazgatunk
community,
ide-oda és
which
munkát
doesn't only
vállalunk
mean that
típusú
we can travel
közösség,
wherever
hanem ez
we
egy
want and
értékközösség is.
take up
És,
jobs. It's
és ezek a
also a
fiatalok, ezek
community
azért
of
mennek el,
values.
mert otthon
And the
érzik
reason these
magukat
young people are
Európában,
leaving
mert
is because they
nyugodtan mennek
feel
el,
at
nyilván
home
mindenféle
in Europe.
egzisztenciális kihívások mellett, mert
Besides
nem érzik azt,
all
hogy
kinds
nekik
of
rosszabb lenne
challenges of how to make a
határon
living,
kívül.
they don't
És ez
feel like
azért
it
van,
was
mert otthon
worse
érzik
for them
magukat.
outside of the border because they feel
És
home.
erre a
And
csoportra, korcsoportra kellene építeni, és
we
most
should build
nézek a
on this
Zolira, aki
age group, and I'm
oktatótársam,
looking at Zoli right now, who is a fellow teacher,
a magunkfajta emberek, amellett, hogy oktatunk
people
sok-sok
like
éve,
us,
de mellette
we've
sok-sok
been
éve
teaching for
dolgozunk,
many years,
elég
but
sok erőt
also we've
befektetve
been
azon, hogy
working and
védjük
investing a lot
az
of
emberi jogokat, demokrácia és jogállamiság alapértékét a
effort
magunk
protecting rule
eszközeivel.
of law basics
És hát nyilvánvalóan
to the best of
fáradunk,
our
nem tudom, Zoli
abilities,
és
and we are getting
András és
tired,
többi, hogy
obviously. I
vagytok
don't know,
ezzel, de hát
Zoli, Andras, I don't know
hát én
what
időről
you
időre
think, but
fáradok.
from time to time I'm
És
getting
hogy
tired, and
kellene megint egy nagy erőt
we
összeszedni,
should gather our
és
forces
nagyon
once
intenzíven összefogni
again
annak
and quite
érdekében,
intensively
hogy
join our
közösséget
forces so
építsünk, hogy
as to
nem
build
intézményesített
a
keretekben, hanem azon
community,
kívül,
not
ugye
just the
szóba
institutional
hoztátok
frameworks,
korábban
but
ezt
besides
a
that, as you
demokráciát
have
tanulni
mentioned,
kell, és évtizedek
democracy is
óta
something that needs
terítéken
to
van,
be learned,
hogy
and for
kellene tanulni, de
decades
még a magyar
we've been talking
társadalom
about how
minden
we
ízében nem
should be
tanulta meg a
learning, but
demokráciát, és
Hungarian
valóban így
society
van,
is
ez
yet
egyébként,
to
ha
completely
praktikusabb
learn
akarok
it.
lenni, még
And
az
it's true, if
oktatási
I was to be
módszereinkből
more
is üvölt, hogy
pragmatic, it's also
egyszerűen
due to
nagyon
our
messze vagyunk attól, hogy
educational methods. We are
demokráciára
far
kész
from
állampolgárokat neveljünk, akár az egyetemek
raising
falai
citizens
között.
ready for democracy
Vita,
in
eltérő
universities,
vélemények
people
tisztelete,
disputes, respecting other
merész
opinions,
kiállás, saját vélemény
courage,
hangos
standing up for
képviselete,
your opinion, representing what
és
you believe,
amellett, hogy teljes egyenlőségben és
and
egymás
having complete
töretlen tiszteletében
equality
hiszünk.
and
Valahogy egy ilyen jellegű
respecting each other.
dialógusra kellene minél több fiatal
This
csoportot
is the kind of
sarkalni. Én
dialogue that
magam
we
egyébként
should
ezen
provide incentives for.
rajta vagyok, az elmúlt évem
Far as
az
I'm
arról
concerned,
szólt a
I'm
Helsinkinél is
working
egyébként,
on
amellett, hogy az
it.
egyetemen is emberi jogokat tanítok,
I'm
de az
teaching
egyetemen kívül
human
is,
rights at
hogy
university, but
interaktív
also outside of the
vitagyakorlatokon
university,
alapuló,
so that
storytellingen
we
alapuló,
have interactive
mindenféle az embert megmozgató
storytelling-based
eszközök
things
alkalmazásával
that
alakítsunk ki
we
olyan
employ tools
programokat,
that get people to
amelyeket sok
move and
más
to come up
partner is
with
csinál
progress
sporadikusan.
that a lot
Most
of other
gondoltuk itt Amnesty
partners are
Internationalre, helyi
doing as well.
szervezetekre, mint mondjuk a
Amnesty
Pécsi
International,
Emberség
local
erejével, külön egyetemi
institutions
oktatókra is,
in
akik a
Pécs,
maguk
for example,
köreikben
and
ezt
all
védik,
kinds of
nagy-nagy tisztelet
university
a
teachers who are
munkájuknak,
defending this
de hiányzik az
amongst
összefogás,
themselves, and
hiányzik
a lot of
az a
respect to them,
lendület,
but
amit az
we are
adhatna,
lacking the kind
hogy
of
ebben
momentum, the kind
megismerjük egymás
of
tevékenységét, és segítsük
joining our
egymást.
forces so
Én
that
most az elmúlt
we
fél
can
évben
learn of
Miskolcon
each
valósítottam meg
other's
egy ilyen
activities.
jellegű
Recently, I've
többnapos programot, oktatási programot,
implementing a
már
training program such as that
előkészületek
in
zajlottak a
Miskolc
pécsi
several
programra, én
days,
magam
and
oda
also in
teszem magam,
Pécs, I'm
pedig
doing
tényleg
it.
utolsó erők,
These
de
are
azt
just
hiszem, hogy ezek az utolsó erők, ezek
less
hatványozódni
forces, but
fognak,
I
mert hogy ez
believe
annyi
that
örömet
these
is ad
will
egyébként minden egyes
multiply
ilyen
because it
program,
also
hogy
gives
érdemes csinálni,
everybody so much pleasure that it's
és
worth
most
doing
2022
it.
előtt
And
nagyon
now,
fontos
before
lenne, hogy egy nagy-nagy
2022, it
véghajrát
would be really
a
important to
fiatal
really invest
választópolgárok
all our
csoportjával
forces
elsősorban
primarily into young
véghez vigyünk.
voter groups.
Na, hát erről egyeztessünk majd,
So
Zoli, veled.
I say we talk
Nyilván.
about that, Zoli.
Your energy is fantastic, Esther. And in support of what you have just said, let me say that if you look at what happens at the universities, there are some universities that are being devoured or before being devoured, and now the student councils, some of the student councils, tend to stand by the government. And we don't know why, we will never know why, but the students themselves do not take the side of the government. And it is a very interesting phenomenon, and I think the potential for you know expecting democratic values from their institutions is very high among students. So students can hold responsible their councils and their institutions for respecting the democratic values, and in the meantime the environment seems to suggest to students that you need to conform, don't concern yourself with politics, and similar messages. So you need to have a civil courage as a student to be active, and it's not enough for if just a few teachers and other instructors professors help them. They need more help, and I think we are in a sort of trap. And I try to change this institutional culture in my institution, but it didn't really work. And now let me just add one more aspect to this. When Esther said that it's so great that the European Court, that the law vexating the NGOs is incompatible with the EU law, but there were some civil organizations, some NGOs who refused to comply with those measures. So, and that's when something really happened. That's when some results occurred. So if you don't have the civil courage to oppose these incompatible laws, then nothing happens. So this is what my experience was, that whenever we had a revolution for emancipation, it always happened if the movements, if themselves, the institutions or the organizations themselves were actively involved in resisting. And I think that the Hungarian civil society, Hungarian social groups, including the Roma people and their representative bodies, they will have a very big responsibility and a very big role in voicing their concerns. Thank you very much for your input, and I can totally agree with Esther's um, Esther's view on civil societies, and our NGO also promotes European values, and this is our goal to shape European consciousness, European identity, and civil courage. And now let me ask Andras about his input. What do you think could be the most important aspect in addition to constitution and civil associations? Zoltan has already started talking about it. I was already thinking about the word civil courage, uh, uh, and then he said it, and I think it's a very important thing, and I'm so happy that we have more than just buds of this in our society, let's say in universities, or resistance to the restrictive measures and similar things. And I also totally agree that it will only work if everybody pushes the pedals in the same direction and at the same with the same force also. So if your opponents put a stick in between your wheels, you can still move forward because uh, there's a joint effort. And I think all these stakeholders have to push the processes to the same direction. And I think there's another very important aspect that you already mentioned, that in these processes we can only achieve some real change and not just superficial changes if we change our cultural, if there's a cultural change in the country, and there's a government that respects, truly respects democratic intentions, and not just respect them, but spearheads them, because I think that's what's necessary. And I think the constitutional process that we already mentioned will only start if we have the necessary political capital and the necessary political force in power to spearhead these efforts. And I think, you know, if you look at the parliament, it means the presence of at least 133 MPs. It requires the presence of 133 MPs to launch this process. And if you look at the current Hungarian government and the things that they built up in the past 10 years, I think they believe this is a masterpiece. They think it's a master's work, and I don't think we should make compromises in terms of democracy. I believe that I am certain that they will use each and every tool they have, each and every opportunity they have to extend and put and keep this kind of political establishment on the lifeline. And I think that, you know, if you look at the Constitutional Court or other institutions, and the head of the National Bank and the media authority, and so on, there are lots of supposedly supposedly independent institutions where the government's delegates are put in places of power, and Fidesz shaped these institutions to its own image, and uses them to help to extend the power of Fidesz. And I think, of course, you know, it's part of the picture. But I also think that some members of these institutions will give a bigger priority to serving the nation, truly serving the nation, than just the government. But unfortunately, the majority of them will side with the government in such case. And if you look at the political macro processes, you will see, well, I don't see the possibility of a two-thirds majority victory for the opposition, which could give way to a constitutional process. So, as long as the political reality is not there for such a victory for the opposition, then until then, we will have to think about what measures we can take, what we can do in the current framework to dismantle this system, or at least dampen the effects of this system in certain areas. How we can, you know, reverse certain institutions, the role of certain institutions, so that they would truly serve the interests of the nation. All other all other talks are basically just self-serving, because these are the most important issues. And I think I'm for action in this case, by the way. I believe that our role is to help the people who want to act, and our responsibility is to give all the opportunities and direction to the people who want to act, and so that they could actually use these opportunities and truly act. Thank you very much, Andras. I think this forum here is some sort of action, at least talking action. We are talking about these problems. You mentioned, Esther mentioned the young people, which gives me a very good segue to give the floor to Balázs, because you know, the young people are actually one of the main target groups of this forum. And let me give the floor to Balázs so he could ask questions from the youth point of view. Thank you very much, Esther, and let me welcome all the panelists and visitors again, or greet them. And let me tell the audience first that we are looking forward to their questions through the chat box and through Facebook as well. And now let me ask my questions from the panelists. You mentioned this period of democratization of Hungary. Of course, I wasn't a part of it personally because I'm too young for that. But if you look at today's society, we live in a very, very polarized society, and we can see young people are finding very difficult to understand the processes, like how the government is trampling upon the democratic institutions, and many young people actually turn to moving abroad. And as Andras Pulai also said, that young people can't really see how the EU is counteracting these undemocratic tendencies in Hungary. So this so our goal would be to make a dialogue, or launch a dialogue among the young people to understand the processes. And now my question to Andras is that we can see many young people turn away from the government and they want a change in our political uh, arena. But what could the young people do in this? And how do you see the involvement of our youth in the discussion of core values? Thank you very much for the question. It's a very important question. I'm partly optimistic about this. What we can see is that young people are turning away from the governing parties. I'm just, and like for example, the opposition has a 10% higher approval rate than the government, and I think it's a very important opportunity for reaching out to the young people, like, like we could call them the friendship group of people worrying for democracy, because they have not been pampered in the past period, and they didn't get much help as to how to learn from the processes. So I think their involvement is indispensable. And I also think that the communities like yours or the groups like yours is very important, and you must reach out to as many people as possible. Of course, if you want to reach out to a huge group of people, you have to be involved in politics, because political organizations are the ones who can reach out to many people, because they have their voters, they have their supporters. I think their responsibility is paramount. And as far as active people can be, the activity of certain people can be, reduced or reversed, or transferred from the bad side to the good side, so to speak. That's a difficult question. I'm not quite so but I'm not quite optimistic about this. But there's one area where I am optimistic, is that we could involve young people. There's a clear trend in Hungary which shows that young people are show very little interest in political affairs. It's very difficult to reach out to them. Their stimulus threshold is very high, meaning that it's very difficult to reach out to them or get them involved, especially if you compare them with the older generation, who are really true voters. And but I do have some reason to be optimistic, although it's not a big optimism. I don't really see how we could reach out to hundreds of thousands of youngsters. I think we need to have some common thinking about the communication methods, the communication channels, finding the communities that we can build up, so that we could reach out to these hundreds of thousands and even millions of people. And there's one more thing that I want to mention, is the general level of education, the quality of education. We have to improve it. It's very important. Research findings show, our research, but other institutes' research as well, that there's a very high rate of functional illiteracy. The official number in Hungary is around 20%, I think. And as far as the young age groups is concerned, it's even higher. And how could we expect a young person to be politically active and understand democracy fully if are if they lack the most fundamental skills? So there's a lot to do in this area, and we can actually suspect that there's some sort of intention on the government part when they withdraw funding from the education and rechannels those funds to a certain group of government supporters or business circles, and maybe other institutions, pro-government institutions. And I believe that I can't really go into many more details because the time is too short for that. But I have to say that I'm partly optimistic and partly pessimistic. Thank you very much. I think it's a very important aspect to mobilize this age group. Now, my next question is to Esther Kiersch. It could be a positive thing that our young people feel at home in Europe. I think it's a good tendency, and I think the improvement European consciousness is very important mission and goal for us. But just a few decades ago, the trend was typically that these young people came back to Hungary, returned to Hungary, and the brain drain was not so efficient. But now the brain drain seems to be more efficient because the young Hungarian people tend to stay in Western Europe. But so the trends are not good. But do you see a light at the end of the tunnel, or do you think there's something that people can trust? Balázs's microphone is switched off.
Én Balázs nem hallottam, de azért átjött a kérdés lényege.
Well, I didn't hear the end of your question, Balázs, but I did get the gist of it. I'm sorry, something happened. Somebody muted my microphone in the middle of my sentence. Okay, so if you got my question, then Eszter, the gist of it at least. Maybe somebody thought your question was too long, and they muted you in the middle. You thought it was me, right? That I couldn't process your question and I stopped you in half. No, I didn't. No. Okay, so existentially speaking, of course, this has a very important existential value. What prospects young people could have in Hungary?
Úgy döntenek, hogy esetleg nem jönnek haza.
You know, or maybe they are in Western Europe and make the sad decision not to return to Hungary. I don't know what kind of job opportunities they could have in Hungary, or I can't really give you a great prospect and tell you that there will be lots of good jobs in Hungary. But now, reflecting on what Andras said, and reacting to the question that
hogy a fiatalok nem érdeklődnek a politikai
people are not interested in politics and that they are very passive.
Az itthonmaradásnak egy oka az, vagy a hazajövetelnek egy oka az, hogy ezek egzisztenciális okokból egyszerűen jobb karrier lehetőségeket látok, stabilitást látok, és a többi. De lehet az is oka, hogy valamilyen dolgon van itthon.
The other reason could be that the young
valamilyen felelősséget érzek a hazai közösségben, a saját
they have a responsibility for the Hungarian nation,
én most egy kicsit egy mikroszintre
and now I would like to bring this down to a micro level, a personal level,
de most ez jó
and maybe I'm thinking to this micro level, but in the good sense of the word,
and I
would like to talk about my personal experience. Of course, I cannot back it up with any statistical data or tell you that maybe there are hundreds of thousands of people who have the same opinion and could be involved. I'm not sure about that, and I think it's too late to hope that there would be a huge group of hundreds of thousands of young people to get involved in the elections in 2022.
Hát én nem az absztrakt számok embere vagyok, tehát hogy én teszem, amiben hiszek, teszem azt, amiben azt gondolom, hogy egy konkrét közösségben van értelme, és én azt látom, hogy amikor egy konkrét fiatal csoporttal találkozom, 20-30 fős akár egyfős csoporttal, akkor azt látom, hogyha az ember konkrét történeteket vesz elő, konkrét kárvallottjait a jelenlegi rendszernek. Nyilván az én a szervezetem a Helsinki Bizottság mandátumánál fogva és a saját munkaterületemnél fogva talok emberi jogsértésekre, tehát amikor nem absztraktan beszélgetünk arról, hogy hát itt diszkrimináció van, és hú, hát a romákat ez mennyire sújtja, és ettől nyilván senki nem fog könnyű tejteni csak így, ezek miatt az absztrakt fogalmak miatt. hanem amikor az kerül terítékre, hogy figyelj, a Miskolci kórházban plusz pénzt fizettetnek a roma nőkkel ilyen-olyan köpenyért, meg a hozzáférjüknek, hogy bemehessenek a szülésre, és mindenhogy vegzálják verbálisan, és figyelj, ezek konkrét esetek, amik így 2 házzal arrébb történtek, mert te mondjuk éppen a kórház közelében laksz a Szentpéteri kapuban, akkor az megfoghatóvá válik, és arra én még nem láttam olyan fiatalt, aki nem háborodik fel, és nem mondja azt, hogy Jézusom, mit tudunk tenni ez ellen? Történt valami, és rögtön érdekli azt, hogy milyen bírósági döntés született, rögtön érdekli azt, hogy milyen jogszabályi környezet vonatkozik erre, rögtön érdekli azt, hogy az ombudsman mit csinál, az ombudsman nem csinál semmit, miért nem csinál semmit? Tehát én abban hiszek, hogy igenis, egyrészt a fiatal korosztályban hiszek, és idejött az egyetemi korosztályt, és van egy ilyen vélemény is, hogy középiskolán túl már nem érdemes a fiatalokkal foglalkozni, mert mindenkinek kőbevésve a véleménye, nem hiszek ebben, az ember sokáig tud változni és változtatni a nézőpontját, csak meg kell tudni szólítani. És ez a megszólítás, ez lehetséges, hogy nem a klasszikus, akár a hivatalos oktatási rendszerben is megszokott eszközzel fogunk működni, és nem absztrakt fogalmak és nagyon okosnak tűnünk, mert tudunk egy kalap alatt beszélni a korrupcióról és a bíróságok függetlenségéről, stb. Csak épp az egyszerű ember azt se érti, hogy miről beszélünk, mert konkrétan nem válik húsvér kérdéssé, ami a konkrét embert érinti. És hogyha a konkrét ember szintjére visszük ezeket a jogállamisággal, demokráciával és emberi jogokkal kapcsolatos problémákat, akkor már is felhorgadás van, és hozzáteszem, nézd, még egy egyszerűen menthetetlenül optimista vagyok, sajnos tényleg, és vakon optimista, de hogy hozzáfűzném azt, hogy azzal kapcsolatban is pozitív tapasztalataim vannak, hogy a helyi szereplők és csendes szereplők hogyan reagálnak az ilyen jellegű kezdeményezésekre, ami oktatási programokról, közösségépítésről szól, akikkel én helyben most nyilván a friss tapasztalataim az Pécshez, Miskolchoz kötődnek, akikkel én felvettem a kapcsolatot, akik szimpla középiskolai és egyetemi oktatók, nem emberi jogi harcosok, és nem lehet őket olvasni az újságban a nevüket, és verik a tamtamot a jogállamiság védelmében, viszont tudom, hogy nagyon hiteles emberek, tudom, hogy nagyon jó érzésű emberek, érzékeny emberek, és amikor megszólítom őket az, hogy figyelj, szeretnék közreműködni ebben a programban, és hoznád a diákjaidat, és aztán folytatnád, és használnád a módszereket. Óriási lelkesedés, és azt látom, hogy készség ezekre a megkeresésekre. És hát tényleg csak azt kívánom, hogy minél többen multiplikáljuk ezeket a programokat. Én nem vagyok ehhez elég, a Helsinki Bizottság nem elég, ehhez egy szervezet nem elég. Minél több helyi szervezetet és helyi egyes hiteles embereket kell megszólítani, akik valamilyen közösségben vezető szerepet töltenek be, hogy ők aztán adják tovább az üzenetet, és használják ezeket a módszereket. És nem valószínűleg, még egyszer mondom, optimista vagyok, de azért teljesen naív nem, tehát nem állítom azt, hogy ezzel fogjuk megváltani a világot, és 2022-ben beköszönt a paradicsomi élet Magyarországon, csak azt mondom, hogy ez egy lehetséges irány, ahol itt van tennivaló, és tudunk előre.
I'm not saying that, but I think that we have some tools to use. Thank you very much for this optimistic view. It's a very important in these difficult situations. And I totally agree that many young people are outraged and they do have this hunger that you mentioned for democracy. And now let me forward this question to Zoltan Flack. In addition to these things that we mentioned, what other ways are there for us to reach out to the young people and to get them involved in the discussions about political issues that affect them? Well, excuse me, Balázs, if I break down the optimistic view that Eszter presented. As a matter of fact, Eszter and I, and maybe everybody else in this group, we live in an elite bubble. Our children go to elite schools, study in and we teach in elite universities, and we meet different people than most of the voters. Um, Although I do agree with Esther that these techniques are very important, astoundingly important, but let me say that this will not change our political culture in the short run. If you look at the history of European democracies, you can see that there was a relatively short period that we could truly call blooming or booming, like where the democratic institutions were actively involved, and that's the time of welfare, political welfare. For example, if you look at the social democratic welfare state, or that's absolutely necessary. If we don't have welfare states, then rich countries, rich nations will drain the brains away from the poorer countries, and the poorer countries will be frustrated because their best minds will leave them. And no matter how hard we work on smuggling the democratic values into our education system, and we can maybe create wonderful constructs, and maybe we can reach out to dozens of people, and that will be a fantastic achievement considering how many tools we have. But it's not going to change the general culture. And Esther, for example, if you look around in your microcosm, you can see that even in our microcosms, it's not easy to change somebody's minds. It's a question of decades, actually. And life is freaking short, and we have this short life, and we want to live in a livable country, and we are working hard. And I do believe that grassroots movement or bottom up movements are very important. But if you change nothing at the top, if you don't change the political system at the top, and uh, and I'm also looking at the chat questions, and let me reflect on one of those questions. Yes, masses of young people receive the distorted messages through the media and through the social media as well. They get these very successful propaganda machine messages. Like, for example, the anti-Soros campaign is very strong. Even university students, even legal students, students of law, we need to explain them that the public interest is not necessarily the same as the prime minister's interest, the way the prime minister explains it in the media. And if we don't change this environment, then we will have a hard time winning over the young people. It's more like a Don Quixote mission for us, but we do need to do it. I think that our viewers and our panelists received a very balanced view of optimism and pessimism. And now let me give the floor back to Esther. Thank you very much, Balasz. And now I think we have reached our time limit. So I think uh, I would like to ask you to fill out the feedback sheet, and let me give the floor for the panelists for a final round. And if you can, mention you mentioned France and Germany, and but we focused on Hungary primarily, which is totally understandable. But we are an all-European uh, group, so, and there are some other foreign participants as well. So maybe we could say a few words about what we could expect from Europe. And now let me give the floor to Andras first, if it's okay for you.
It's absolutely okay. Thank you for the floor and the question. And yes, I have also seen the chat window, the question related to French, German, and European. Right. Well, first we have to wait and see what's going to happen to the German elections. So we don't know who will be appointed for chancellor will become chancellor. So until this process concludes, I don't think there will be any changes in the attitude of Germany. I don't think there will be. Germany is a proud business partner of Hungary, and we are not fully interested in what's happening with democracy. Sometimes you will have uh, an article in Spiegel with somebody raising their finger that we are watching and we know what's happening, but we're not doing anything. So I don't think this is going to change this year. And next year, it's not going to change because we'll have the elections. So we're going to have to wait what's going to happen in Hungary with the elections. And if there are any changes during the elections, we may have a new situation arising. But as far as France or Germany is concerned, I would be surprised if there were any major changes. Nobody appointed for chancellor has said that they would have a different attitude to the democratic strife of countries in Germany's backyard. And as far as the EU is concerned, I think that if we look at the convergence fund or the COVID fund, I believe these processes will continue. And if they continue as these organizations have promised, and the parliament is dictating quite, imposing quite a tight schedule to the commission and other organizations that they won't accept steps that some member states want to code into the system, then potentially we may have a breakthrough, especially as based on this decision, it is not necessary to have 100% majority of the votes for these systems to be introduced. A simple majority is enough in the EU, and by the way, Hungary voted for this as well. It's a unique thing. We need to wait for the decision of the European Court to how the system of institutions to be introduced, whether this will correspond to the contents of European law, and if yes, then it can be enforced as of 1st of January 2021 retrospectively. So potentially this will be the start of a slow process when these organizations start doing this. Amongst others, we will need to define what a violation of democracy is. We don't have an exact definition right now within the EU, so we need to have one. And there are a lot of technical and pragmatic steps that need to be taken so that these decisions can be enforced. And well, this is a process that will be applicable from the 1st of January 2021 if the court decides so. There's nothing we can do insofar as foreign organizations are concerned. We just need to wait. And obviously, if you look at America a few days ago, 2 days ago, I don't know what day it is, 3 days ago, it was quite a change. Potentially, they will also have a different approach to the question of democracy than compared to the approach of the former government. So we'll just see as it's said in Brussels. Thank you very much on behalf of the interpreters. And now I would like to give the floor to Esther Kiersch for some closing
rövid
remarks.
leszek.
Okay, I'll be
Kicsit
brief.
én is megnéztem itt a chatben
I have also
a kérdéseket, és
looked
csak
at the
egyre
questions in the
reagálnék, és
chat
ezzel
window
végül
and
is a
would like to react
zárszó
to one. And
fókuszába illeszkedik, és
this
talán
is in the focus, in the
az
limelight of my
észrevételem,
closing
mint hogy
remarks.
ki ellenőrzi azt, hogy a nemzetközi
So
bíróságok
who
által hozott
checks
ítéleteket tiszteletben tartják
whether
a
the
magyar kormány.
decisions made by international
És
courts
hát azért
are
itt
respected?
lehetséges, hogy ez nem
And it's
közismert,
possible
de
that it's not common
ugye mi
knowledge,
magunk
but
is, hogy itt szóba
we
került
ourselves, as we
megint
have
itt a
once again we
civilekkel
talked about
kapcsolatos nyári döntés. Hát ezeket mi folyamatosan monitorozzuk. Tehát ez nem azt jelenti, hogy akkor itt megszületett egy döntés, nem vonják vissza az érintett jogszabályokat, és akkor innentől kezdve a történet vége, és szomorkodunk, amikor majd már nem csak a nem tudom én hírtévés tábja jelenik meg a kapuinknál, ami elég tehát sokszorosan előfordult már, és a médiában, közmédiában jelenünk meg, mint közellenségek, és akkor, de hát itt volt egy luxemburgi döntés, de ez nem ér semmi. Nyilván az érintett fórumokon, európai szinten is bizottságnál természetesen hát felemeljük a szavunkat annak érdekében, hogy politikai nyomást gyakoroljanak a kormányra ezekkel az ítéletekkel kapcsolatban. Az ökotárs ugye az egy több évvel ezelőtti nagyon-nagyon drámai és elfogadhatatlan eset volt, de azért az elmúlt években nem találkoztunk azzal, hogy megjelent volna a rendőrség a civil szervezetek irodáiban, és feltúrta volna az irodáinkat. Természetesen megtettük a szükséges biztonsági intézkedéseket, mind digitális adatainkra vonatkozóan, mind fizikai értelemben, és élünk a jogorvoslati lehetőségekkel, és nem csak, nyilván itt nem csak a luxemburgi bíróság, mondjuk például a strasbourgi bíróság döntése is felmerülhetnek, a nemzetközi bíróságok. Hát ott meg az Európa Tanács Miniszteri Bizottságánál folyamatosan toljuk be az érvelésünket azzal kapcsolatban, hogyha az ország nem tesz eleget a bíróságban ítéletekben szereplő, és nem csak kártérítésre vonatkozó döntési elemeknek. Tehát nem arról van szó, hogy ezeknek nincsen élete ezeknek az ítéleteknek. Most egy legutóbbi példát említsek. A májusi pozitív példával szemben itt van egy decemberi luxemburgi bírósági döntés, amiben meg itt a kollektív Szerbiába való visszakényszerítések, menedékkérők Szerbiába való visszakényszerítésével szemben mondta ki a luxemburgi bíróság, hogy az Európai Uniós jogok sért és alapjogokat, és ott például továbbra is, hát azóta több mint 2000 embert kényszerítettek vissza a magyar rendőrség Szerbia területére, Magyarország területéről mindenféle esetű mérlegelés nélkül, hogy adott esetben mondjuk egy kínzást elszenvedő menedékkérőről van éppen szó, akit visszakényszerítenek egy egyáltalán nem biztonságos harmadik országba, és amellett, hogy a helyi hatósághoz fordultunk, amellett a bizottsághoz is fordultunk azzal kapcsolatban, hogy a figyelmüket el ne vonják már arról a tényről, hogy egyébként Magyarország nem tartja tiszteletben ezt a bírósági döntést. És itt akkor egy utolsó üzenetként és a civil kurázsi, ami ugye vesszőparipám, és itt egy másik chatben szerepel egy komment, ahol felmerül az, hogy na hát igen, mi a helyzet akkor, hogyha a NAV megjelenik az ajtóban és kopog, amiatt, hogy az ember a politikai véleményét kifejezte. Nincsen az ember egyedül. Nekünk például a Helsinki Bizottság, nekünk is van egy hétköznapi hősök elnevezésű programunk, amiben jogi segítséget nyújtunk azoknak, akik politikai véleménynyilvánítás miatt a hatalommal szembe kerültek, és súlyos kár érte őket, vagy jogsérelem. Nincsen az ember egyedül, hála Istennek, és nem csak a Helsinki Bizottság az, említhetni például más civil szervezetet azt is, aki segít azoknak az embereknek, hogy jogorvoslati lehetőségekkel éljenek, hogyha ilyen helyzetbe kerülnek, és akkor ez megint a bíztatás hangja, a civil kurázsi hangja, meg az optimizmus hangja, és itt akkor le is zárom a hozzászólásomat.
Thank you very much. We always need those sounds of encouragement, and we are out of time, and I would like to give the floor to Zoltan Flack for a short closing remark. And this is a closing remark. I will try not pessimistic. Let me tell you something that's specific. I think that if the question is, what is the task of the European Union? What is the task of European forces in Hungarian democracy regaining its strength and Hungarian citizens regaining their faith in democracy and the EU? We have the Hungarian propaganda about how the West is declining. We have these traditions. The West is weak. It's in crisis. It's best to turn to Moscow or China because the EU, as part of the West, is in crisis. And I can tell you that the EU should do all they can to strengthen relations that are not between governments, not official uh, connections, but connections between the NGO relationships, NGO organizations. This should be structured in a conscious manner, that this should work as a network so that they can present what European values mean in practice. I know very well how university students coming back from Erasmus, what their take on the world, how different it is. This should be conveyed to people in schools, people working, municipalities, people in rural areas. It's not enough to formally have sibling town, but we should have civilian NGO relationships, and these should be supported by European institutions, and we could call it a European civil society. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And this European civil society, this is also something which is one of the most important strives for us as a pan-European organization, the Union of European Federalists, and we try to represent European interests to the best of our abilities, amongst other, as a result of this panel. And I would like to say thank you for all the insightful contributions on behalf of the panel, all the encouragement, and I would like to say a big thank you to all participants for all their activity. You were really active, you asked a lot of questions, and hopefully in the future we will be able to talk about this in a more positive manner. And I would like to say a thank you to the Secretariat of the Union of European Federalists so that for launching this process and for us to be able to talk about the situation in Hungary. So thank you very much. And I am now closing this event, and Facebook recording will be available